Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. The first time in a while that I've posted any album reviews on this channel. As you might be able to tell, I'm sick right now. My voice sounds like shit. It's been a while since I've uploaded any reviews, and since then I have changed my rating system, which I mentioned. I'm rating albums out of 10 still, but not using half points. I explained in a recent video what that's all about. And there's a part of me that wanted to wait until I'm feeling a bit better to get this video filmed, but really that's just another way of me delaying getting these videos out. And I feel like once I get back into the habit of it, I'll feel more motivated to actually upload more videos. So today I'm only doing 5 mini album reviews, and these are reviews that I was working on probably at least a month ago, more than a month ago, and I'm just now getting to the point of actually filming them. So yeah, these reviews I worked on a long time ago. Some of these albums I haven't even heard in a while, and yeah, I'm just now finally uploading the reviews for these albums, which I listened to a while ago when they came out. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure what is going to be coming up in the coming weeks on this channel for album reviews, but I do have some ideas. Anyway, for now, I just kind of wanted to get another video out there, so let's talk about these 5 albums, starting with... I've mentioned before when talking about the supergroup Boy Genius that I'm not really a huge fan of the trio, nor any of the solo artists' music based on the small amounts that I've heard. But after recently going through Lucy Dacus' album discography, I can't acknowledge what she brings to the table as an artist. I think she became somewhat of a critical darling due to a unique lyrical style with detailed storytelling that isn't afraid to get uncomfortable, albeit with a debut album that left basically no impact on me. And while her second album did bring a bit more energy musically, it's 2021's Home Video that comes to mind first for me when I think of Lucy Dacus. It's the album of hers that I'm most familiar with, and also probably my favorite up to this point, although I do say that as someone who isn't really a huge Lucy Dacus fan. Because while Partner in Crime is an absolutely incredible song which showcases Lucy Dacus' songwriting ability at its absolute peak, the rest of the album really felt like it should have been a lot better, and often felt hindered by small nitpicks that I have in both writing and sound. And while Lucy is a very good singer, her voice sometimes leaves me in a bit of an Adele situation. By that I mean listening to a singer who is technically really impressive, but whose vocals I'm just personally not the biggest fan of. It happens sometimes. But that being said, one of the first things I noticed about this new record is that I think the vocals have improved quite a bit. Or at least I like Lucy's vocals here more than on previous albums, where it seems to have a much softer timbre which fits really smoothly over these opulently produced instrumentals, which aren't the most groundbreaking thing ever, but still sound absolutely gorgeous, with some moments feeling almost like artistic soundscapes for a museum or something, like the title track or the album opener. And when the vocals are placed pretty much perfectly in the mix, that also gives this a huge boost. And while this can sometimes sacrifice huge melodic choruses, let's be honest, Home Video didn't really have a lot of those anyway, and even as someone who didn't fully click with that album, the lack of strong hooks wasn't really the reason at all. And here I'll at least admit there are moments like the alt-rock outro of Lost Time, or the chill but peppy chorus of Best Guess, and I like how Bullseye sounds radio ready in a good way with a simple yet effective chorus. And some of these tracks are quite different from what I was expecting, like Talk, which almost sounds like a feeble little horse song, and the title track has some absolutely beautiful guitar and piano and some heavenly production, which sounds better than pretty much everything on Home Video. Now when it comes to the lyrics on this project, oh boy, this gets vulnerable, and in a lot of ways that most artists aren't willing to put out there into the world. Or you know what, maybe it's not just as much that as it is that Lucy Dacus has just had such a unique experience with a lot of the topics she's writing about, including her new relationship with her longtime friend and bandmate Julian Baker, who a lot of this album is about, and she actually appears on the album herself. Although she isn't the only person written about on this album, and I don't want to speculate too much on which songs are and aren't true stories, because even though the writing style implies most of them probably are, that's a guess, I also remember the closing track in Home Video, which Lucy explicitly said starts as a true story and then turns into fiction partway through. And it also happens to be one of the best songs on that album, in my opinion. But I think I'm even more impressed by the writing on Forever Is a Feeling than I was on Home Video. Or at least it doesn't have the same flaws that make me wonder what the point she's trying to make is. That's not to say that those don't occur. The pre-chorus of Ankles directly contradicts the verse, but they're not as frequent. And I do think the detailed writing stands out a bit more on this album, like especially in a song like Limerence, which might be one of her best songs lyrically, describing a desire for someone she can't have and unfortunately the way it negatively affects her morals. And the key with that song is not taking it seriously, rather as an actually healthy way of dealing with those emotions, and by that I mean art, not the actions described in the art. I should clarify that. And some of these lines are really cutting, like, is there a difference between lying to you if it feels just as bad as telling the truth? And the grammatical error of an incomplete sentence has me wondering if she's specifically emphasizing a moral dilemma regarding lying and which specific way to lie. Yeah, I'm completely overthinking this, I'm aware. And the fear of a relationship ending on For Keeps is really haunting. It also comes with great lines like, I don't believe in anything anymore except you and me supremacy. And I like how Big Deal talks about a past relationship and the inescapable truth that it was, and in some ways is still a big deal, a significant part of her life, at least to get to where she is now. And Hosier is a guest on Bullseye, which shows a flashback to a relationship that wasn't really built on connection, rather the feeling of having accomplished something. Although that wasn't apparent at the time. At least that is the way I read this track. Lucy has kind of said otherwise, but I still like to interpret lyrics in my own way sometimes. There are also some brighter moments lyrically, which are most likely highlighting her current relationship, most of which appear toward the end of the album, like the title track, Most Wanted Man, Best Guess, and Lost Time. Although the last two come with slight asterisks, like the wish that it had happened sooner on the latter, and the former acknowledging it might not work out in the long term, even though she's confident it most likely will. And it's the album's slow progression from the past to the future, with the willingness to subtly admit to getting lost in a memory throughout this progression, that really makes for such a unique album that's gotta be among the best that I've heard this year. Considering the slow start 2025 has had for great albums, although I wrote this a while ago, and I have heard a few more since then, which I do think are probably great, which I'll review in upcoming videos. And yeah, in a better year, this might not stand out as much. Again, I wrote that a while ago, I'm reading this off a script. And there is a semi-dud here or there, like Come Out, and even though I mentioned it not really being an issue, an album having this little emphasis on catchy melodies can usually only go so far, and there's nothing else particularly unique to completely make me look past that. But still, if you can't tell based on everything I've said so far, I think this is better than Home Video, and I think it's her best album to date. I was struggling to give this album a rating. Should I give it an 8 or an 8.5 or a 9? Because they're all basically interchangeable using my former rating system, but now I can simply just call this an 8 out of 10, because really only time will tell how much replay value this has for me. But it's well written, it's emotionally vulnerable, but also brimming with joy, and ending on a mostly happy note, despite the hints of sadness along the way. Because that's how life works. No matter how beautiful it is, it'll eventually end, and you might be wondering why you never took chances you could have, or why you didn't choose a different path. Wow, that got dark quickly. So let's just shift things to a happier note, and again, 8 out of 10. Great album, what a surprise. I'm excited to hear whatever she does next. Alright, so I originally wasn't planning on reviewing this album. I mean, how many critics really care about a new Mumford & Sons album in 2025? I feel like the critics didn't even care back when they were actually popular in the mainstream, and the vast majority of what I've heard by this band has been mediocre at best to outright terrible at worst. But as someone who will at least somewhat defend I Will Wait, I knew this band could at least make a decent tune here and there, so I figured I'd give this a listen or two, and then I'd probably forget that it ever came out and move on. But I was actually surprised to find out this is actually pretty decent. And in large part is because Mumford & Sons gave these songs quite a bit of energy without losing the sense of rawness in the vocals and instrumentation, and not setting their ambitions too high with this project. And that does have its limits, which is why I wouldn't call this album anything more than just decent, but the opening track is a perfect example. It seems to represent a feeling of comfort, and it has a nice musical build throughout the track, even though it doesn't really have the best standout melodies or anything. And even on the next couple of tracks, there's quite a bit to like, just not enough to really make them stand out a whole lot. Although Caroline is actually a pretty great song with really crisp production and detailed lyrics that seem to be about the narrator's memory living on in someone else's life as they both go their own way. And Rushmere, the title track, has some banjo or something that kind of reminds me of I Will Wait, and I think this track's pretty good. The melodies are kind of drab, but there's at least some musical intensity and feeling to this track. Now, from this point on, the album is a lot closer to what I was expecting, with a lot of basic tunes that feel like alternative radio filler. But hey, at least it's well produced, and Marcus Mumford is a good enough singer that this can be fairly pleasant, even though the dullness can be a bit much. But the album's also just over a half hour long, and now I'm realizing I'm just going back and forth on what makes this album better than I was expecting, and what makes it still a pretty uninteresting listen. Although at least Truth has a fairly robust chorus, with some of the better melodies on the album, even though it's one of Marcus's weaker vocal performances on the record. Now, lyrically, there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot to it, mostly just finding comfort in other people and sending positive messages while trying to keep empathy in certain moments like where it belongs, where that can be hard to do so. But really, it just doesn't have a lot of depth as far as I can tell, and once again, the majority of this album I ain't gonna remember in a couple of years, or even a couple months or weeks, although I wrote that like a few months ago, a month and a half ago maybe, and I barely remember this album right now, honestly. But still, I can acknowledge some of the moments that work lyrically. I mentioned Caroline already, but I also like how the closing track looks at motivations for humans' actions and intentions, and how there's a certain basic level of decency we should all have. And really, I think the main point here is to express bafflement at how some don't recognize this. And again, most of the lyrics are fine, just not all that noteworthy to me. And really, I've already kind of run out of things to say about this new Mumford & Sons album. I wanted to acknowledge it because it is better than I was expecting, and if you've ever liked anything by this band, you might be intrigued by it. But this is absolutely not essential listening. You're not really missing a whole lot if you choose to skip it. For me, it's a 6 out of 10. Really, the main reason I'm reviewing this is because of the surprise factor. I think the first half of the album is actually quite strong, although the only great track is Caroline. And then after that, it loses all its energy and has back-to-back total duds in Anchor and Surrender. So as a whole, yeah, it's fine, but don't take me reviewing this and somewhat praising it to mean more than it actually does. So originally my plan was to review this album in its own dedicated video, and no, it wasn't just stuff coming up in real life and all of my videos getting delayed that caused this to not end up as its own review. But considering how I usually do my reviews, it might seem like a bit of an odd idea to review this album individually. Yeah, Spiritbox are one of the biggest mainstream metal acts to break out in the past few years, and their 2021 debut, Eternal Blue, hit #1 on the US rock album charts. And they're famous enough that even those who don't listen to metalcore at all have probably at least heard of this band. And considering that I like to pretend I have a huge audience when planning which albums to review, that reminds me that this would be a hotly anticipated review in that alternate reality. Again, on paper it makes sense, but also it's a metalcore album that is about as mainstream as you get in a very non-mainstream genre. Typically, I save the individual album reviews for huge pop stars, or else albums that are among the very best of a particular year, or just albums that give me a lot to say for any reason. But as surprising as this might be coming from me, as someone who typically hasn't been the biggest fan of metalcore, Eternal Blue was actually exactly the album I didn't know I needed in the fall of 2021, as 16-year-old Simon was starting to feel the weight of some kind of Blur's Day syndrome where everything I had previously known came crashing down and the world revealed new sets of truths at a pace I couldn't keep up with. And part of me feels like it was just the timing of it all which made that album resonate with me on such a deep level, where I found myself clinging to every last word emitted by one of the most beautiful voices I have ever heard, and the screams are absolutely insane. Seriously, I won't mince words, Courtney LaPlante is one of my all-time favorite vocalists, not just in metal, but in any genre, mainstream or otherwise. But look, I also have been consistently going back to Eternal Blue in the 3.5 years since its release, and it's never lost any of its magic for me. Part of me wants to call it a comfort album, but in a lot of ways it's the complete opposite. It brings me to a place of darkness that I don't want to acknowledge, but that I also need to feel in order to get the sense of relief and serenity that it provides to completely wash over me in the best way. And before I go too deep down the rabbit hole of explaining all my personal experiences with growing up and the psychology of peace, fear, and, well, all that jazz, look, it's worth mentioning that the scattered singles and EPs that Spiritbox have released in the years since have been really good, but also not super special to me, which was disappointing considering just how highly I was anticipating more music from this band. But I also had a really strong feeling that the follow-up full-length album was going to be amazing. I mean, it had to be, right? Well, in my most recent mini-review video, which was a while ago now, I said that Squid's newest album, Cowards, was arguably the most disappointing album of the year for me thus far, but that there was also another contender for that title. And unfortunately, I gotta be honest here and confirm I was talking about Tsunami Sea. And before you start freaking out, I want to once again give the context that this was quite possibly my most anticipated album of 2025 in any genre, or at least very close. Again, I just assumed this would be getting its own review because I expected there was no way it would be anything less than a near masterpiece. I wasn't expecting another Eternal Blue in terms of quality or sound, but that's basically an impossible standard to live up to. And what we got is a great album, but I can also see so many places here where it is starting to feel like the band is running out of ideas. And while I can still praise this album for doing a lot of things really well, It's the kind of album that makes me really worried about future projects from this band. And I don't want to be harsher than I really need to be, considering that my frustration with this project has more to do with the expectations I had going in, and that's not something I can criticize the band for. But there's also a level of quality I would expect from anyone following up a debut that resonates with me as much as Eternal Blue did, and this just doesn't get there. Seriously, what the hell happened on this album? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the departure of bassist and backing vocalist Bill Crook in 2022, who tragically passed away last summer, which I wasn't aware of until after this album already came out. And the closing track, Deep End, is a tribute to him that I personally really wish I liked a lot more than I do. But on a lighter note, regarding the music on this project, I can't help but notice a lot of the weaker hooks, such as the unpleasant slushiness of the opener Fata Morgana, a dreary bagginess in Ride the Wave, and especially Soft Spine, which is the one track where I can genuinely say I don't find Courtney's vocals all that pleasant to listen to, and I don't think I've ever been able to say that before. I mean, it's not bad, it's just not a track that has much to offer in my opinion, without any real strong dynamics or detail to make the very one-note metalcore have any resonance for me. And I think that brings us to the production, which does sound pretty a lot of the time, but also leads to some moments such as No Lost No Love, where the meatiness of the guitar timbre doesn't pair well with the vocals. And the worst part is that Courtney's vocals on this album can often sound quite processed, and I'm not going to say it ruins the vocal performances because, again, this is Courtney fucking LaPlante we're talking about. She can save pretty much any song, regardless of where her voice is placed in the mix or what effects are on it. But it is kind of frustrating in tracks like Crystal Roses, where I'm left feeling like this could have been absolutely amazing if the vocals sounded more natural, because it's not the vocals themselves that are the problem. And it's not that I can't acknowledge the moments on this album that work. A handful of these tracks have some absolutely jaw-dropping moments, such as the vocal harmonies to cap off the chorus of Perfect Soul, the wave-like vocal melody in the chorus of the title track. I'm not sure if that pun was intended or not. The interlude-like midsection of A Haven with Two Faces, which is an excellent breathing moment in a very heavy track. And No Lost No Love has some incredibly haunting spoken vocals, and the words Courtney is saying really bring certain imagery to my mind, which I could go a lot deeper on. But this brings me to discussing the overall themes of the lyrics on this album. And I'm not sure if I want to say Spiritbox have never really been about the lyrics for me, because while they're not my main focus, the way that Courtney sings specific lines can really have an extra bit of magic that wouldn't be there without at least some gravity that I find in the poetry. And on this album, I did find some potent moments. I often struggle to fully piece together what they're trying to say in their songs, but I do often find my own meaning in them, and it's worth mentioning that it feels like this album came out during a similar time in my life as Eternal Blue did. Yeah, I know it's been over 2 months since this came out now, but I also wonder if it's just because Spiritbox's music has meant so much to me over the past few years that it's less of a coincidence and more just a result of these albums being released. Because there are a lot of parallels between these two records, or at least the feelings that they evoke for me, even if this one isn't nearly as strong and probably won't have as much of a lasting impact on me in the long run. Now, that's not to say there aren't still some strong lyrical moments that I can admire, like the heartbreaking look at the impact of expectations placed on women in society in Keep Sweet, or the way Perfect Soul depicts someone so caught up in the past that they feel there's no way to move forward and need to stay stuck in the place that they were in, at least the way I read it. And also a sense of disconnect from the mainland as a Vancouver Island band, which shows up a little bit on this album. And the sense of not feeling good enough in the title track is the one that really gets to me personally. But I don't know, something feels missing. It's like each time the band is really close to capturing the same kind of magic they did on their debut, something is just not quite clicking as much. And it leaves me giving this an 8 out of 10. Still a great album, but like I said earlier, it feels like the band is running out of ideas, painting themselves into corners and repeating melodies too much without building these songs as much as they could have. I don't know, we'll see how much replay value this has for me. Again, I like a lot of what this band is doing here, but it doesn't feel complete. It doesn't feel like it fully hits as much as it should. And yeah, just considering some of the EPs that they've dropped and just the underwhelming output of this band ever since their debut, I'm starting to get worried about whatever might be coming next. Again, it is a great album. It'll probably be in my top 50 of the year, but it's not going to be as high on that list as I was hoping or expecting. Here's a one-man black metal project, which I have talked about before on my website back in the day, although I haven't reviewed any of his albums. My first introduction to Andy Marshall's solo project Saor, which I used to mispronounce as Saor, was his 2022 album under this name titled Origins. Now, I haven't listened to much Saor outside of that album before this one, But I did mostly like what I heard when I listened to the other project or the other albums by this project. And this is definitely an artist I want to listen to more. And most notably, I really loved Origins, and revisiting it in preparation for this review, I was still really impressed by the layered instrumentation, the way the melodies and rhythm instruments complement each other, and the rock solid mixing and production that let it just hit like a ton of bricks. And I'm also really enjoying this new album of theirs, which at least to me feels like it has a bit of a cleaner sound, whereas Origins felt a bit more foggy at points. And don't get me wrong, I liked some of the foggier moments on that album, as long as it didn't sacrifice emphasis on the melodies and as long as it didn't completely drown everything out. But I also like that the production sounds a bit clearer on this record. I don't know, maybe I'm just imagining it, but it certainly feels that way to me. I'm not sure there was actually a change in producer or not, but I certainly noticed a difference in sound, whether it's actually here or not. Lyrically, this album is about the ancient history of Scotland, Andy's home country, and while this puts me in a tricky situation as I don't have nearly the history knowledge on any of this stuff that I wish I had, really my history knowledge is pretty terrible in general, I can still admire Andy's ability to connect the past to the present in ways that transcend typical history lessons, not only in the words, but through the music as well. I think that was probably Andy's intent too, where as soon as you fall into the rabbit hole of deep philosophical thinking surrounding things that are and were real, the answers you do get, as well as the lack of answers, can summon so many emotions, including sadness and fear, but also peace and comfort. And I think the musical palette that Andy paints from beautifully captures those feelings in ways that I haven't heard in a long time, at least not all at once like on this album. This album is 5 tracks long, all of them over 8 minutes, and all but one over 11 minutes, starting with the title track, the second longest on the album, which has some brilliant melodies and some amazingly well-layered instrumentation. Everything blends really well to create a very smooth texture without losing any of the grit that makes this so appealing in the first place. They also find the right time to cut out a bunch of the instruments and then slowly build it back up again, and the woodwind outro was a nice touch as well. Echoes of the Ancient Land immediately kicks off with some ferocious lead vocals which are very clear in the mix, almost as if Andy is expressing frustration about not being able to bring back humans from centuries ago, and he wants to live within both time frames while letting them experience our current world. But we were all only made to be here for a short period of time, and later in the track, that reality truly sinks in, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. But it's also got so much vigor and simultaneous beauty in the gorgeous strings and guitars that it feels like a reminder to just keep living your life. Enjoy the time we've got. Glen of Sorrow was written about the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, which isn't a subject I'm very knowledgeable about. I read a little bit about it, but either way I will mention this track could have done more to actually give more detail about this subject. Because as it is, this kind of feels like it could have been about any historic massacre. But it's still an incredibly well-composed black metal piece with some fantastic vocal melodies and a real sense of musical progression throughout the track. From there, we get the second to last track, The Sylvian Embrace, which Andy has said is about being in nature and how peaceful that can feel, as it can be an escape from everything else going on in the world. It's the shortest track on the album, and lyrically it's just the same poem, written by Andy, repeated 4 times. And in a song like this, whether or not I'm going to love it depends on the instrumentation and the sound, and the delivery of said poem here is varied, starting with the whispered delivery and then adding guest vocals. I feel like on a different album this could feel out of place and a little dragged on considering the 8-minute runtime, but on this album it kind of feels like an interlude, and I think it really fits well into the track listing. It's a nice breathing moment before the punishing instrumentation and vocals on the closing track Rebirth, which to me brings a feeling of potential connection between the lives of the distant past and those in the present, but also a more realistic feeling that is most likely just a philosophical fantasy that isn't in our realm. But it also gives a real sense that maybe nothing ever truly ends. The album ends with the line, "We're bound by fate forevermore." But my question is, bound where? And I think that's pretty much the perfect way to sum up this entire album. The desperate longing for a discovery about ancient history and the ways it might stick with us, but also recognizing that the past is the past, and at least that sense of hope for something can help us appreciate the present, even if we know deep down this is our only reality. Could I be completely overthinking this? 100% I could be. Maybe I'm not, and maybe I'm just thinking about it wrong. But Saor delivered one hell of a black metal album where all the small details I didn't mention can be uncovered by listening to this yourself, which I highly recommend you do, at least if you're a fan of black metal. And one more thing I haven't yet mentioned, as much as the majority of this record is absolutely awesome, the outro of that closing track alone makes this entire project totally worth it. So easy 8 out of 10 for me. It was damn close to being a 9 out of 10. I guess it could have used a bit more lyrical detail to totally win me over to the point of putting it in my absolute top tier of black metal. But it's still really damn close, and I think I probably like this even more than Origins as a full album. And I understand this might not be for everyone. In comparison with Origins, the melodies are a little bit more subtle, maybe not as catchy, and it doesn't feel like there's as much emphasis on the individual tracks. It maybe requires a bit more patience. But man, this was exactly the kind of black metal I've been dying to hear this year. Absolutely amazing album, one of the best of 2025 that I've heard thus far, and you'll probably love it as well. Alright, so here's a famous power metal band who have been significantly but not exceptionally critically acclaimed for a few decades now, this being their 10th album. I listened to their first 9 once each a while ago, like a few months ago, but I didn't pay super close attention. That's what happens when I review this much music. I don't get to listen to as many full discographies as in-depth as I would have liked, and like I've said, it's been a chaotic few months for me. And I remember mostly liking, but not really loving what I heard. But I gave this new album quite a few listens, and I can get behind some kick-ass power metal at its best, so I was fairly optimistic going into this. And I think it lived up to my expectations, but didn't really exceed them. Because yeah, it's got the basic level of intensity that I expect from a power metal record, and some of these moments do go pretty damn hard. But it also doesn't feel like an album worth going back to when I could be listening to some kick-ass black metal, or at least something with more standout melodic hooks that actually has a bit more punch to it. Now, if I'm sounding harsh, well, it's not that I think this is anywhere near a bad album. In fact, I like a lot of the sounds that show up on this record. I just don't think it coalesces into anything more than a fairly solid power metal album. And as someone who's a little bit of an outsider looking in on that genre, maybe I'm just not the right person to properly give this a well thought out review. But I also can notice the moments where this doesn't quite click for me, and the issues that I know are the reason for that. And considering the other albums that I've talked about in this video, which are mostly great, I do start to pay extra attention to the unflattering ways that the drums are mixed here, where they either have too much emphasis on the kick, or the snare is just way too quiet, sometimes both, such as on the Moorland at Twilight, or the moments on the album where the choir and strings try to make the sound much bigger and epic than it actually is, without having the right melodies or low-end power to really make this fully hit. Avalon is a perfect example. Or there are moments like the chorus of Against the Wind, where the drumming is so fast and intense, it just feels way too in your face for its specific moment on the album. It could have worked in another context, but something's just not quite right. Now, I think one of this album's strengths is the ways the songs feel like they're anticipating something, and then the break into huge choruses, like on The Witch, which may not be as melodically interesting as I was hoping, but it still goes pretty hard, despite some production nitpicks I have. And Bring On the Night does a good job of building tension before a mostly explosive hook, which, again, I think could have used a bit more punch. I think the bass is a bit too quiet for my liking on this one. And really, it's not a good sign for the album when so many of the moments that actually work for me still have significant asterisks on them. And it's the reason why I don't expect to be going back to this album much. I think the one song that actually goes really fucking hard is the opening track, Creepshow, which actually has a really strong melodic hook where the vocals are well mixed and the high and low frequencies work in tandem to let this thicker texture feel meaty and really slam into your ears without feeling overblown or overwhelming. It's a really great way to start the album, and if I wasn't sick right now and my voice was working, I'd try to sing the chorus for you right here because it's just so good. But then you got a song like the 9-minute title track, which thinks it soars way higher than it actually does. Yeah, the vocals are wild, but not in a good way if you ask me, and it's honestly a little grating, and something sounds a little bit off in the production that I can't quite place. But it's just not hitting nearly as hard for me as I feel like it should. So with all my bitching and complaining, you might be thinking, Simon, didn't you say this album wasn't anywhere close to bad? Does that mean it's pretty good? And yeah, I do think it is, partially because Tobias Sammet's vocals are usually impressive, when he isn't painfully wailing on the title track, that is. And there's enough energy throughout this album that most of it is pleasant while it's on. But beyond that, and a couple really good moments, it kind of feels like just another power metal album. And really, the issues that I personally had with this record didn't as much annoy me as they took away from what could have been a much better album experience. And unfortunately, what we got just isn't really sticking for me. Now, before I finish up this review, I do want to at least briefly mention the lyrics. And by that I mean acknowledge that this is power metal, and who's really going to it for the lyrics? Okay, maybe that wasn't fair, because any genre can have lyrical substance, but here a lot of it just feels more based on imagery and grandeur to fit with the musical sounds going on. And in some parts of the record it works, although I do sometimes wonder if I'm just missing something. I couldn't piece it all together, but I also didn't really try because I'm just assuming it's not that deep, an assumption that isn't really based on strong evidence, I'll admit that. But anyway, I do like the apparent theme of embracing challenges on Bring on the Night, with the imagery that leaves it somewhat open to interpretation, but it also seems to be more about not being fooled by what you think you want on the surface. And beyond that, you can fill in the blanks as to what they're actually saying. And Unleash the Kraken seems to represent a sort of breath of fresh air, which I think mostly shines through in the poetry and the sound of the track. And while Against the Wind is pretty generic lyrically, the freedom found within oneself to be authentic and not try to fit others' molds is admittedly quite heartwarming when paired with some magnificent strings and the guitars that really do soar. And considering I think the album ends pretty well with everybody's here until the end, even though I really wish the vocals weren't so buried in the mix, well, I'll call this a good album. In fact, a very good album. I'll say this is a fairly solid 7 out of 10, maybe even a pretty strong 7 out of 10, but I wouldn't call this great. But it's possibly close to great. And really, if you're not into power metal, then I probably would just say don't bother with this. But if you are at least somewhat into the genre, then I can definitely give it a tentative recommendation. Just don't set your expectations too high. Again, I think it's really good, close to great, but I don't think it quite gets there.